Okay, so first I'm going to explain what exactly was the Stanford Prison Experiment. What happened was in 1971, Dr. Zimbardo, who was a professor at Stanford University, wanted to examine what would happen if you put good people in a bad place. Now, his chosen bad place was a prison. So he decided to take the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University and turn it into a fake prison. He then took volunteer students and randomly assigned them to the roles of prisoner or guard. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but instead it only lasted 6 days due to the harshness inflicted by the guards and the fast chaos that ensued from that. The guards had become brutal and humiliating, and the prisoners basically lost their identities. Well, really, everybody in the experiment basically lost their actual identities, and the experiment is now known for being completely unethical and cruel. It resulted in shame and guilt from the participants. Not only was there obvious psychological damage, but the guards got violent with the prisoners, and some of them even experienced physical illness due to their emotional distress. The Stanford Prison Experiment basically showed that when pushed, it's very likely for human beings to act immorally. It showed the influence that power, or perceived power, has on individuals. There were a few guards in particular who were specifically cruel and were considered the instigators of the immorality that occurred. One of those guards was nicknamed John Wayne for his kind of macho, cowboy-esque behavior. He was the most brutal one, and he was obviously influenced by his want for power. And the other guards, even ones who didn't particularly agree with what he was doing, they were influenced not to act against him because they believed him to have power over them. He was dominant, and they felt dominated by him. So what it really showed is just this descent into immorality that happened so quickly. Now, the original fall of man, Genesis 1, God creates Adam and Eve. He placed them in the Garden of Eden and gave them instructions for how to live. Now, the world was perfect at this point. There was no sin, no shame, no fear, no pain. And really, they were instructed to care for creation, care for the animals and wildlife around them. And they were also instructed not to eat from a particular tree in the garden. But one day, a serpent, which was the devil, convinced Eve to eat from the fruit of that tree by enticing her with the potential to be like God, to know all, and to be powerful. And she eats the fruit and then convinces Adam to do the same. The result of this was obviously that sin entered the world, but it also resulted in a lot of fear, guilt, and shame for Adam and Eve in particular. And what this story really shows is that people value power and control. It also shows that we are innately sinful. And because of the decision that was made that day, human beings will be sinful at heart until the day that Christ returns. Now, the golden calf. So in Exodus, God rescues the Israelites from their enslavement in Egypt. Now, during this time, they're wandering through the desert looking for the promised land. And one day, Moses goes up to the mountain to collect what we later come to find out is the Ten Commandments. But the people at the camp below become impatient. They feel as though Moses is taking too long to return. They don't know what to do. Life in the desert isn't easy. And so they basically lose their faith in God and decide to take matters into their own hands. They start complaining, and they complain to Aaron specifically, who's kind of left there almost in charge of the group. And Aaron kind of devises a plan to appease the people and build a golden calf for them to worship instead of God. So the people easily agree to this, and even if there were individuals who didn't fully think it was a good idea, such as Aaron, they acted in their sin as a group anyways. So Moses comes down from the mountain and sees this worship of an idol, basically, and this participation in immorality, and is furious. And God is furious as well. And as a result of these actions, God plagues the people. He sends a plague down, and as a consequence of their immorality and their idol worship, and they were physically punished for their sinfulness and their very easy descent into immorality. So what were the consequences of, we've touched on it a little bit, but what were the consequences of the fall of the golden calf and of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Like, these are all three seemingly separate things, and although the fall and the golden calf are both biblical narratives, they do have something in common with the Stanford Prison Experiment. So the consequences of the fall, besides the entrance of sin into the world, and pretty much every bad thing in the world, was a lot of shame, fear, and pain. And we can see that these are very similar consequences to the Stanford Prison Experiment. The parole officer at the end of the experiment, one of them, he talks about how he literally felt sick at what he had become, because he didn't see himself capable of being as cruel as he was, and as humiliating as he was, but he very almost easily fell into that role. And you can see from the documentary that we watched that a lot of the prison guards felt badly about what they had done later on, and then also how shamed the prisoners felt even years later. So a lot of them explain it as basically being one of the worst times of their life, that they had never felt that low before. Now, what were the consequences of the golden calf? Well, basically it angered God, and it angered Moses, and a plague descended upon them, so their physical bodies were harmed. And in the Stanford Prison Experiment, although some physical effects did take place, such as violence and the psychosomatic issues, the minds and emotions of the people were what was truly hurt. They completely lost touch with reality. Even Zimbardo himself lost touch with reality, and he admits this. He admits to saying that at one point, it became very real for him. It wasn't an experiment anymore, and he had to end the experiment because he himself had fallen so deep into it. And we see that a lot of the prisoners and guards basically are going to carry these effects with them for the rest of their life. What these examples demonstrate about human behavior is basically that we're all innately evil, that pushed to the right limits, we'll do things that we never saw ourselves doing. The Stanford Prison Experiment only took 6 days to completely break some people, just as the Israelites turned away from God the second things got hard. We're sinful, and we're easily manipulated and controlled. Adam and Eve were manipulated and tempted by power and by Satan. Aaron in the Bible was easily manipulated by the people who he was supposed to be looking after. And we see that the guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment were manipulated by those who they believed to be more powerful, such as the John Wayne character. And we also see that people like to blame their problems and their sin on others. The Aaron in the Bible blamed his issues and blamed the entire thing with the golden calf on the people, saying, well, look, these people are evil. And Adam and Eve Adam blamed Eve and really God for his fall, and telling God that it was his fault that he gave this wicked woman to him. And the guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment blamed their actions on the situation they were put in. Oddly enough, actually, though, the main guard, the John Wayne character, did own up to his actions. He said, I made the decision. And of course, part of this is part of his narcissistic personality. But I really did appreciate that he took responsibility for his actions, because ultimately we have the decision to be moral or not. Our circumstances can influence us either way, but it's not anybody else's fault that we make the decisions that we do. We behave the ways that we do because we're sinful and because our world is broken and we are broken. So would the Stanford Prison Experiment would have been different had the principal investigator, so Zimbardo, operated on faith-based principles? Honestly, I don't think so. I don't think it would have made much of the difference. The only difference that it would have made is that the experiment probably would have ended sooner, and he already cut it off short, but it wouldn't have even lasted 6 days if he was acting on faith-based principles. At the first sign of dissension, he would have stopped the experiment because he would have seen the damage it was causing. Instead, he lost sight of it himself, and he was so concerned with seeing the results of the experiment that he refused to end it until it had already caused so much damage. He also lied when the parents came to visit the prison. He made it seem a lot better than it was, and that should have been his first sign that things had gone too far and that he was doing something wrong. Ultimately, though, it's not Zimbardo's fault that the participants reacted the way that they did. These people had a choice on what they were going and how they were going to react, and they chose to be evil and controlling. That had nothing to do with Zimbardo. That was just the evil nature of humans. Yes, he did tell them, you're not supposed to let the prisoners get out of line. You can't let them escape, but that truly is what prison guards are told to do and how they're told to behave. And we saw that there were some prisoners that didn't think that violence and humiliation was the best way to go, even though they didn't say anything about it. So really it was just their decision.